Hello, welcome to this section. This section has a long title. Essentially, it's about installing and configuring the Cloud SDK. So if you recall from a previous video, there were three essential ways that we interacted with Google Cloud Platform. One was through the Google Cloud Console, which we've been using quite extensively so far. And the two that we have not been using are the CLI, the command line interface, or any language-specific client libraries like Python, that let you program using Python or Google Go or Java, right? And it's these latter two, the CLI and the client libraries, that encompass Cloud SDK. Okay, so in terms of installing it, there's instructions, and they're rather lengthy, and they're very operating system specific. So I'm on Mac OS, so there's a Mac OS option here. I'll let you do that on your own. So now that we've installed the Cloud SDK, we're going to first focus on the command line interfaces. So the principal command is called gcloud, and before you try to use it, you have to go and initialize it. Now, we'll just walk you through what that looks like. So I go over here, I'm logged in, gcloud init. It's going to take a second to start up. And it's asking you to log in. So you say, okay, sure, yes. And you choose your account. I'm using my training account. And it says, are you allowed to do this? And you say allow. And that screen finishes. So now if we go back to the command line tool, it says pick a cloud project, or first of all it tells you you're logged in as a certain user, and then it says pick a project to use. So in this case we are going to use the training main account. So I put 1, and it's going to ask you whether or not we want a default compute region and zone, but we're not going to worry about this now, so we're going to say no. Okay, so let me clear my screen. So now I'm logged in. So let's look at another command. So the next thing we want to do, if I want to kind of see what I just did, so if I do gcloud config list, it basically tells me the information that I essentially provided, right? Here's my account and whatever that is, project. And the idea is you can actually have multiple configurations. So this is the default configuration, and I just displayed the values for that configuration with gcloud config list. Okay, so the next thing you might want to know is, well, what are the configurations I've got configured, right? So I can hit paste here, gcloud config configurations list, and that's going to list out that I have a single configuration called default. It's got this account and this project. So pretty straightforward. Now let's say you wanted to have a separate configuration. So maybe you want to log in as that Phil account. So I can hit gcloud config configurations create. Oh, you have to give a name. Phil. Okay, so I've got a configuration called Phil, but I really haven't authenticated Phil or anything. So actually now that I'm in Phil, I can do, again, gcloud init. And I want to reinitialize this configuration. And I want to log in with a different account. I want to use my Phil account. And allow. This is done. I go back to the command line. So Phil has access to a different set of, well, actually he has quite a long list of projects he has access to. He's going to log into maybe his marketing one, which is 2. And now if I run this config list, I can see that now I'm logged in as Phil, right? This is the Phil configuration. And if I then run, let's see, list of configurations, I should see 2 configurations here, right? So now I have 2 configurations. So in reality, for the most part, when I've used this tool, I pretty much only have a single configuration. But by the way, you can have multiple configurations and switch between them this way. I guess the other command here too is to activate. So if you want to switch back to the default configuration, which we should do that actually. Okay, so I'm back on the default. So if I do gcloud config list, I should be logged back in as training and on my training main project. Okay, so those are just some basic configuration commands. And gcloud's got thousands of commands, so we're not going to go through those. But just want to make sure you understand about configurations, how you can have multiple of them, and how to switch between them. So we're going to take a quick sidebar into quotas because it'll come up a little bit later. And I want to make sure we understood what it was before we saw something about quotas. So, one of the things that Google Cloud Platform does is they provide limits around how many kinds of resources we can create in a particular project. And 2, in a project, there's also the number of the rate of API calls that you can make. So the idea generally is you just can't overload Google Cloud Platform by creating thousands and thousands of particular resources. And also, you can't also just slam their APIs, make 1 million requests per second. There are limits. They'll basically start throwing errors at some point. And now these quotas, again, are associated with a particular project, right? And 2, they're not fixed forever. If you hit a quota limit, you can actually go in and up them. So I guess I should quickly show you where you can sort of see what your quotas are and maybe interact with it in the sense that you might want to increase it. So if you go to IAM, the very bottom of this list is quotas, and you will see, once it loads, so these are all, how many are there? There's lots here, and then there's actually 227 quotas that can be here. And it tells you if any of them are at limit or close to limit, it'll be at the top here, and it'll give you a warning, and it'll give you the option to click a button where you can request more quota, right? And so some of these quotas, again, are how many subnet ranges you can have, and some are about API calls. So like here's an API call, limit request to 100 per second. Whereas some of these are how many firewall rules you can have. So there's essentially 2 kinds. One's about rates, one's about hard limits on the number of resources that you can create. Okay, so that's what quotas are. We'll see it shortly, and I want to make sure at least you understood that there was such thing as quotas. So let's go through an example usage of maybe a usage of gcloud that might look familiar. So earlier we created some identity access management policies. I think we granted Phil access to our project, like viewer access. And one way of looking at it, of course, is you could go to gcloud, go to not gcloud, you can go to the Cloud Console and click on the IAM button and then look there and you can see it. You can also just run this command here and essentially get at the same information. Hit enter. And so this basically dumped out. So here's, for example, I guess I don't want to look at all of this right now, but you can see one of the entries we created was user Phil Larkin Tucker LLC, gmail.com, with the role of viewer, and of course the training is the owner. And there were some other ones that we just kind of glossed over before, but they're here too. So again, this is a API call, or ran a gcloud command, made an API call to return the policy bindings for that project. So that was the project training main. Okay, so again, that's just an example of hundreds of commands one could use. So now, one of the things here is we've been talking about gcloud principally here. There's actually a number of other feature-specific command line tools. So instead of having 1,000 options or gcloud, they start splitting these out into other ones. So gsutil principally involves with, and we'll talk about this later more, but there are things called storage buckets that we can basically store files in. And gsutil lets you interact with them. And the simplest of them, now we haven't created anything, so I don't think anything's going to come back. So if ls basically stands list, so I'm listing out my buckets, and I haven't created any, so it didn't error, but it didn't give no output. That's because there are no buckets. So this is the expected result. So there's a couple other ones, like BigQuery has their own CLI tool. So, but that's very feature specific, and we're not going to get down that path right now. Okay, so now we're going to change gears and talk about Google Cloud Libraries. And right, let me refresh that screen. So remember, what this is about is you have a programming language, let's say Python, right? So let me follow this link here, right? And you want to be able to programmatically interact with the Google Cloud APIs. And so Google provides a series of tools that you can install in your language, right, or libraries, that make it very easy to interact with those APIs, right? And for example, we were just talking about storage buckets. One of them is called storage. So here, storage, and there's instructions here on how to install Python, get it working with Python. Now I've already done this in this example, so I was going to just kind of show you at a high level. This is not about Python. This is just making you aware that there are such things and generally how they work. Okay, so we're not going to go through the details here, so let me go back to this. Let's look at the code example that I have here, just to get you just roughly oriented with what we're going to do. So in the materials backing this course, I actually have the Python code and instructions, or more or less, on how to install it. So the guts of this code is in this one tiny file. And you can see what this is doing is this is importing some library from Google Cloud, right, called storage. And I'm basically activating it. I'm listing the buckets, and I'm just printing out the bucket names. So it's much like that gsutil command at ls I just did, but done in programming. So that's what the code looks like. So let's go through the exercise of using this code to interact with our with our project. So let me go down here. So so just generally how you're going to do this is if you have Python installed on your machine, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go into this folder. So let me see if I can do this. And here, the one that says hello counts. And you're going to do pip install -r. There's a requirements file that has all the requirements. Now, I've already installed this earlier, so that's why it was fast, but for you, it probably would take longer. So now that I've installed the requirements, I could just type in Python -m. This is a module, so I'm running it this way. Now, let's see what happens. What we would expect to happen is we would get an empty list. Well, that's not what we expected. Well, it's what I expected. Maybe it's not what you expected. But we were expecting kind of to get an empty result because there was no buckets. So we should have exited without any errors, but we should have seen just an empty line, basically, right? And you can see there was an error here, and it talks about not being authenticated. Now, what may be confused, this is a bit confusing, because we still have our gcloud, right? We have gcloud, actually I can't remember the commands. So let's verify one thing. If I go config list, you see I don't use these particular commands a lot, right? It looks like I'm logged in. I'm logged in as this training Lorcan Tucker LLC. So one bit of confusion here is, for whatever reason, Google's got two kind of independent ways of logging in to the Cloud SDK. One is for the command line tools, so that's what this is. And there's another command you have to run to log in for the client libraries. So it's a little bit confusing, to be honest, but what you do, there's a command, so go back down here. You have to type in this. So let's do that. Let's look at it here. So it says gcloud auth application default login. So what you're basically doing here is you're logging in separately with separate credentials, or maybe the same, but specifically for the client libraries. And again, I'm just going to use the same training account. I'm going to allow it. And close this window down. Now, one thing that's interesting, you could kind of ignore this warning because it actually gets resolved in this last line. And this is why I talked about quotas earlier. So this is just reminding you that when we make these API calls through our code, which could be probably a lot faster than if we were clicking with our fingers, right? It's going to be using training main as the project to bill all the, or not bill, but to reflect the amount of API calls you're making, right? And the point of here is that that's what's going to keep track of, if you start like slamming their APIs, it's going to be against training main that the quotas will be counted against, which is interesting because you can actually, in your code, interact with different projects, right? But here, even if you're working with another project, the quota for the API calls are all going to be going against training main, even though maybe that's training marketing that you're actually getting data from. So that, again, that's a little bit confusion. There's a distinction between the quota project and the project that maybe the resources actually live in. So that's another sort of interesting observation. But now that we've logged in with the client libraries, so we did that. So now let's see what happens if I do this. This better work. And by better work, it should be an empty result, right? So that code went there, looked at the buckets, got a list of the buckets, there was none, and basically dumped out nothing. So that was an actually working example. And I believe that is the end of this video.